This is the Spyderco Caribbean, and this knife is a workhorse that is good for so much more than saltwater environments. So the Spyderco Caribbean here, this model's been out for quite a while. This is made in Spyderco's Taichung, Taiwan factory, and it is made of LC200N. We're going to talk more about that steel later, and it is a pretty big knife. You got 3.7 inches of blade here. It's 14 thousandths thick, or 140 thousandths thick, 0.14 inches thick. The whole knife weighs 4.2 ounces, and this knife is available at Blade HQ right now for $228. The size comparison, the easiest one is the PM2. This is a very similar knife in size to the PM2 with some key design differences. You can see here, almost exactly the same blade length. Big difference here is that you have that choil with the PM2, so you're losing some of the blade to that choil, whereas with the Caribbean, the whole thing is blade. You've got almost the same handle length. Difference is, again, that choil and a bit more pronounced curves on the PM2 with a little bit more neutral and a thicker handle overall, taller handle overall on the Caribbean than the PM2. And the Caribbean, largely because it's just a slightly taller, bigger knife, is a little bit heavier, about 3.9 ounces to 4.2 ounces, not the sort of difference that you're going to see. And the Caribbean is a little bit more expensive, $228, with most stock PM2s coming in the high 180s in early 2024 when I'm filming this. They're also almost exactly the same thickness. It's a little bit hard to see on this dark blade here, but you can see the knives are pretty much as thick as each other. These scales are a little thinner than the stock scales, but very, very similar knives overall. And as I'll go through in more detail in the review, function way more similarly than you might think. Because Spyderco has sold this Caribbean as part of their Salt series. And their Salt series, those are knives that are meant to be used in saltwater environments. That is why you have this G10 pattern here. And let's just talk about the G10 now, because it's the most striking feature of the Caribbean, is the way they do this G10 here. So this G10 has a few very interesting features. First, it's layered G10. So you've got alternating layers of black and yellow G10 here. And what they've done is they've polished the surface smooth. You can see this is smooth here. But then what they've done is they've milled lines in. These are, actually you can see it really well there. These are actually little indentations, and they are very tactile. This is a non-slip surface. It's meant to be. Even though this is slippery, these grooves, your thumb grips them. And if you compare it to something like the peel ply texture that Spyderco typically puts on their stock G10, that is absent here, and instead they've gone for more of a macro texture. The reason for that is if you think about a saltwater environment or a water environment in general, this peel ply texture doesn't provide much grip once it gets wet. Once it gets wet, this will get relatively slippery because it's such a small texture. This will still continue to provide grip even when it's wet because the bigger texture, the meat of your thumb gets right in there. And I will tell you, it works really well. I was using this in the garden just a couple days ago, and even when I was, draining some pots and things like that, this got wet. No loss of performance whatsoever, just as grippy when it's wet as when it's dry, which is awesome. They put a chamfer all the way around the edge here. You can see, and you get this cool effect of, seeing the layers of the G10 just like that. And by the way, it's not like this is like stacked G10. They buy a sheet of G10 that is like this, and they mill these lines into it, and they make sure the sheet is flat, and they mill it to the depth so that the yellow shows through here. That's how this is made, exact same scale on the other side. You got blackened hardware here, and then this is a compression lock, again, just like the PM2. And this one, I could probably loosen this blade a little bit or loosen this pivot a bit and make it drop shut. Right now, it's a sort of very, very smooth shake shut action. Opens very easily. So when it's closed here, relatively light detent, kind of similar to the GB2. If you know the detent on that one, a little bit stiffer than that one, but still pretty light. Taichung tends to make their detent on the lighter side. Does fire out very nicely, extremely smooth on both the open and the close. If I slow roll this, very, very smooth. Took some time to break in, but gets smooth. Nice lockup. If you look at the PM2 compression lock, Taichung compression locks tend to lock up a little bit earlier, but this one's just a tiny bit earlier, and this lock bar has started to work its way over as it's been used, but same design as the PM2, works quite similarly, even, you know, the machining of the tab and everything like that. Even though Tai Chung is making this knife and Golden Colorado made this one, Tai Chung does their compression lock quite similar to how Golden does it, which means they do it very well. It's only Seki City that really has trouble with the compression lock. Back to this handle, and then we'll get to the blade here. Very thick, like tall handle, flat on the top except for those grooves, which do give a lot of traction, and these big curves underneath. What that gives you is that gives you lots of real estate for your hand, and this big front finger guard here is super, super secure. This, as I started to use it, and I was surprised to feel this looks almost like a bit of a neutral handle. But with this thumb ramp here, which has a nice bit of jimping, no jimping down here, just jimping on the thumb ramp behind the blade, and this big finger guard, and this big swoop here for your first two fingers, this feels super secure in the hand, especially when you push on it. You get the same sort of sensation with this handle that you get with the PM2 up in this finger choil, where you get your front finger in the choil, you get your next two fingers on that front swell here, and this is super secure in the hand. It fills the hand a little bit. The Caribbean, because it's taller, is even more hand filling. This fills up my entire palm. And so when I'm gripping down, bearing down on this, these are nicely round enough that I don't feel a hot spot, and it sticks in my hand between the grippiness of this, the flatness of the scales, the flatness of these edges here, and just the hand-filling nature of it, and this front finger guard. And then you add this palm swell here, you add this swell here. This is really, really secure in the hand. And it's also secure, you know, if you want to change your grip a little bit, pinch a little bit. Doesn't work quite as well in a pinch grip like this. You can do it. You can do it. Post these three fingers back here, pinch up on the blade. You can do it, but this is really a knife that is meant to be used in a grip like this, and it feels really, really... Actually, now that I think about it, I used it quite a bit like this. This is because you can really use this front finger guard here, anchor your middle finger there, pinch the blade. I did use it like this quite a bit, and it's relatively comfortable, but the knife shines like this. It is filling up my whole hand in this sort of grip. Really, really good ergonomics, really secure in the hand. And so that's the handle. It works really, really well. And, you know, if you are going to use this around water, the benefit of these bright day glow yellow scales is the visibility is extraordinary. This is not a knife that you're going to lose. This is a knife that you can, you know, drop somewhere and you're always going to see it. This is also a knife that is going to, even under a little bit of depth of water, you're still going to be able to see it. That's part of the reason that they chose yellow here as the color that will stand out. And, you know, just to show sort of like how nice this is to use, I actually realized just before I filmed this, I haven't even taken the little plastic tab off here, despite using this quite a bit. This scale, unlike a P-Apply G10 where you're asking this texture to do everything, it's really just the ergonomics of this handle that are doing all the work, and it's a really nice experience. I was really, really impressed when I started using this knife, how good it felt in the hand. Which then brings us to the blade. So this blade here is, you know, when you really look at it, is very similar in shape to the PM2. If you put these blades right next to each other, if you take away the choil on the PM2, these are very similar blade shapes. Obviously, without the choil, you get more blade length on the Caribbean, and it's a little bit longer and leaner. There's a little bit of sheep's footiness on the top there. The tip on the PM2 comes up a little bit higher, and you can get this Caribbean in a full sheep's foot version. I may end up getting one of those given how much I've enjoyed this knife. But they are very similar blade shapes, and for the same reason the PM2's blade shape is great, the Caribbean's blade shape is also really good. When you grip it here in your sort of standard grip, or you pinch up, the tip of your blade is a little bit below. It's pretty much even with your pivot here. It naturally points out from the hand. This is just a very natural, intuitive blade shape. You've got a very big, continuous belly for long slicing cuts. You know, this would be great for gutting fish, things like that, where you need to make those longer cuts. But it's also, because it gets relatively lean down by the tip, without getting, I mean, it gets thin, but not hyper thin. It gets, you know, pretty similar, not quite as thin as the PM2 toward the tip, but it does get pretty thin. You can get this tip into stuff. You can get it behind stuff. This was a great gardening knife because if I was, trying to get between two little sprigs, I could get this tip right in there and pull something with it, hook something with it, pull it out. But still, if I needed to bear down, you got enough blade here that you can, choke stuff up here and push through it and saw through it. And it's a very nice intuitive blade shape. There's nothing fancy going on here, but this slightly elongated version of Spyderco's leaf-shaped blade, especially with the way it points out of this handle, which is pretty neutral with your hand, and if anything, very slightly down. It's a very intuitive blade shape. And on top of that, it gets down to quite a sharp edge. Not super sharp. This is not going to be the sharpest Spyderco that you got, but it's more than sharp enough, and that is, a predictable consequence of 140, this is probably 145 thousandths blade stock, the same as the PM2, with just like the PM2, tons of space to drop down to that edge. Full flat grind here, and it gets absolutely as sharp as you need to. This is one knife quite often I will end up sharpening my Spydercos pretty much as soon as I get them. I sharpen most of my knives as soon as I get them, because with the combination of the factory edge and just however thick they are behind the edge, I don't love the performance right out of the box. This was an exception. This one I picked up and I started using right away, and is it the sharpest knife that I've got? No. If I gave it my own edge, would it be sharper? Absolutely, but with this blade, with that thickness, that drop, it is plenty fine to do anything that I needed it for right out of the box. Now, if I bring back our PM2 here, this is a knife that just because of its size, if you fold this up, the difference in size from the PM2 is more pronounced when you fold it up. This feels way bigger in the pocket than the PM2, which is not a small knife in the pocket. You can see these squared off edges here do make it feel quite a bit bigger in the pocket. This feels like a big knife when you carry it. And so this isn't a knife that you're going to be picking up and using for, your little office tasks. It will do them just fine. But this Caribbean is overkill for a task like that. And so if you think about, your slightly heavier duty or more extended use tasks, really keen edge geometry isn't quite as important for those tasks. And so that's probably part of the reason that it hasn't bothered me as much, that, this doesn't have the sharpest edge, but the edge is more than fine. And the blade shape and the way the blade shape interacts with the handle is really, really good. It is, when I say that it was a very surprising knife to use, I had the same sort of experience when I started using this knife that I had a few of the first times that I used a PM2 after I really started to learn how to get the most out of pocket knives, which is the edge is always right where you want it to be. It fills your hand, it feels secure in the hand, it doesn't want to move. You don't have to think about the knife as you're using it. I could pick this up, put it toward the task I wanted to, and it would just cut things, and it would just go through things, and it never felt squirrely in my hand. It felt like an extension of my hand. And even as I grip it now, the ergonomics on this handle are so good. It fits the hand so well, and I think that's part of the reason that a blade that by itself is merely very good, it's not trying to be exceptional, but it's a very good blade. That's part of the reason that it feels so good, is these handle ergonomics are so exceptional. You're paying for that with more real estate in the pocket. You're paying for that with a bigger, taller handle and a little bit of extra weight. But I think it's worth it. And I think this G10 pattern, which again uses a macro texture rather than a micro texture to give you grip, really does support that, because it doesn't feel uncomfortable even under lighter use, but it's super secure under hard and even dirty or grimy use. But then the secret sauce, part of the reason why this knife is so impressive to me, is when you really think about LC200N in this context. Now I'm going to do something I haven't done before and get some charts out, because LC200N is a steel that I know I certainly had a very wrong understanding about for a very long time. LC200N, a lot of people learned about it through the Spidey Chef, and it is most well known as a high corrosion resistant steel. Spyderco's Salt series, which this is a part of, they are rust resistant knives, and LC200N is positioned as a pretty much rust proof steel, and it is. But that's selling the steel short for what it does. So let's see here. This is Laren Thomas's edge retention chart. And so you've got, your edge retention here all the way up. This is how many Catra cards that the knife is going to cut through. Let me take this stuff out of the background. And so the higher something is on this chart, the more edge retention it's got. And you can see a lot of your typical steels on this chart. So K390, all the way up here, 710, 720, things like that. ZDP 189, other popular Spyderco steel, over above the 700s. S90V, just below the 800s. 15V, which lots of people got really hyped about last year, up close to 900. Maximum, one of my favorites, over 1,000. These are your high edge retention steels up here. Your standard steels, you got your S30V, your X45, your 204P20CV, all those, your S35, all in this, 550 to 650 sort of range here. Now, LC200N does not have exceptional edge retention. It's one of the lower ones on the chart here, all the way down at, 375, similar to Nitro V, similar to ABL at a lower hardness, similar to 14C28N. Not great. Below VG10, below CPM 154, below D2. Not great in terms of edge retention. This is not going to be a high edge retention steel, meaning you're going to have to sharpen it more often than some of these other steels that we talked about, even like Crewware. Crewware is up here, which is a toughness-centric steel, up here at, 525. Again, LC200N, probably 30% less edge retention than that. But then, the other piece is toughness. So these are stainless steels here by toughness, and LC200N is all the way up here. LC200N is about 30 foot-pounds of toughness. The tougher a steel is, the more abuse it can take, the more likely it will roll rather than chip, the harder that you can push it and press on it without worrying about it breaking, and the more that you can sort of hammer on that knife, use it hard, do a little bit more impact cutting, things like that, without having to worry about catastrophic failure. Tough steels are going to bend rather than break, and they're going to take more torque, more continuous pressure before they start to bend. LC200N is a very tough steel. If you compare this to, MagnaCut, it's about 50% tougher than MagnaCut. You compare it to S35VN, about 3 times as tough as MagnaCut. You compare it to, something like, where is it, your, M398 or your M390 here, about 6 times tougher than M390, which is, another popular stainless steel. And in fact, I'm going to take this over here, 3V is at like 40 foot-pounds of torque. LC200N is only about 1/3 less tough than 3V. It's about twice as tough as M4. It's tougher than a lot of these toughness-centric steels. And that, in my experience using the Caribbean, is a lot of what I have felt with this knife. This is a knife that can be pushed. This is a knife that is meant to be a hard use knife, a knife that you can, the handle is designed for that, the steel is designed for that, the blade shape, which has been proven for years on the PM2 with a little bit of modification here to be a really good blade shape for heavier duty use. The blade shape works really well here, and it even carries, a little bit more of that thickness out toward the tip than the PM2 to boot. This knife with this very tough steel that happens to also be super corrosion resistant ends up really feeling like a workhorse knife above all. I came into the Caribbean thinking that I was going to get not a gimmick knife, but a knife that was going to be useful in one area. And Spyderco does make those. Spyderco makes plenty of knives like that. Knives that are meant for one particular sort of user and that aren't really that great if you aren't that user. I thought this Caribbean might be a knife. It was going to be great, if I was on a boat. I don't have a boat. I don't spend much time on boats, but it would be a good little boat knife. That's sort of how they advertise it. But no, this would be a great little boat knife, But this is just a workhorse of a knife. Got a tough steel, a user blade, an insanely ergonomic handle that is as secure as any handle I've held from Spyderco in the hand, and just gets better as you push it harder. If you look at this just as a Salt Series knife, and you look at the Caribbean just as a knife for your wet environments, for your corrosive environments, for your dirty environments, things like that, it is selling it very short. And this, to my great surprise, has become probably one of the best alternatives to the PM2 that I can think of. As long as you're okay sharpening the steel a little bit more often, because LC200N is not going to have edge retention as high as a lot of, the typical steels you see on PM2s, and certainly not as high as, I've got a Magna Cut PM2. I love the thing, but it's going to be, I'm literally going to be sharpening LC200N 3 to 4 times as often as I'm going to be sharpening Maximet. But as long as you're okay with that, this does everything that the PM2 does really well. And it does a couple of things arguably better. I would say this handle is even more comfortable under significant pressure and under significant, use than the PM2's handle. And that is something that I say about very, very few knives. And the blade is up for the task as well. So this is not going to be an everyday carry knife for a lot of people, just from the fact that it is a big knife. Again, the PM2 is not a small knife, and this is a bigger knife in the pocket than the PM2. And again, you are, if you're comparing your typical PM2, which is going to be, your S45 VN, not with these aftermarket scales, stuff like that, this is a non-trivial amount more expensive, $40-50 more expensive. So it is a more premium knife. You see that in some of the construction here. I mean, this G10 pattern is really cool. It does require more machining than your typical, peel ply G10 texture. Typical Tai Chung, razor sharp on the blade. This plunge is really sharp. The jimping is really sharp. The fit and finish is excellent throughout. But that's just, what you expect from Tai Chung. But you are paying a little bit more for that. But honestly, in a where we are today, when a PM2 is $180, paying $228 for this all day. This is as good a value as the PM2 is, and I do think that it is a knife that a lot more people should be looking at. I'm curious if Spyderco comes to this conclusion at some point, because this is, especially as their Salt series starts to move toward Magna Cut and away from H1 and LC200N, you could see a really interesting version of the Caribbean in Magna Cut that is sold less at, kind of like what they tried to do with the Siren Sprint Run, where this knife would be sold less as a Salt series knife and more as a general purpose, harder use utility knife, where it is exceptional. And so this has probably been one of the most surprisingly great knives, meaning if I think about how much I enjoyed using it compared to how much I thought I was going to enjoy using it, there have been very few knives that have been positive surprises to the extent this one was for me in quite a while. I really, really like this knife. I thought it was going to be one that I was going to try and then pass on pretty quickly, but it's feeling like it's going to be part of my permanent collection here. So that's the Spyderco Caribbean. Surprisingly excellent. Just, there's, other than the size and the price, which really are just sort of helping define who it's for and what use it's for. They're not negatives, they're just factors. You can't have these ergonomics without that thick handle. And frankly, you don't get everything that's going on in this from Tai Chung, Taiwan in 2024 without paying $230 for it. Those are just the facts of life here. If you're okay with all that, seriously give the Caribbean a look, even if you don't need the corrosion resistance. And if you haven't, looked at LC200N too much because, maybe you live in the Midwest, or maybe you live in a city environment or something like that, corrosion resistance just isn't important to you, give the steel and blades like this a legitimate shot because it is a very good steel, and just looking at it as a Salt Series steel is selling it quite short. And by the way, let me know if you like when I talk a little bit more in detail about the steel properties and, steel edge retention, toughness, things like that in these reviews. And I will certainly pepper that in more. For what it's worth, I actually have a degree in material science. I was trained in that a decade ago. Never used it, but I do know my way around some things like this. So if that's interesting and useful to folks, I can certainly bring that in more. I spent 5 years of my life looking at, steel heat treatment charts and things like that. So Spyderco Caribbean gets just about my highest recommendation. If you see one, you can get them for a pretty good price on the secondary market. Chase one down, give it a shot, and I think you will enjoy it just as much as I do. Hope this was a good use of your time. Come back if you want to see more, and I will see you again soon.